Today, we're following up on one of the most issues in the world, which is politics in Nigeria, and especially the aftermath of the recent Nigerian elections. We are delighted to have with us somebody who is ultra qualified to discuss this subject. Darren Q is the executive director, of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development at UMass Boston. He is a graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University with both a master's degree and a PhD. We were chatting just before this started, and Darren told me that he has attended or has observed all of the Fourth Republic of Nigeria elections, as well as being an election observer in other elections elsewhere in the world, but particularly in Africa. He has written a book on Nigerian politics in particular, and is working on another book right now, which I hope this period while he is on sabbatical will give him the chance to actually complete that book. He's also been associated with the Carter Center. He's done work for USAID and for the Department of State. You were present for these elections themselves. So we're going to hear a firsthand view of the elections and what it all means. With that, I think we'll turn it over to Darren, and you will have the chance to speak, and then we'll be glad to take questions from both the folks who are in the room and from the Ethernet or whatever we call it. So,
Ambassador, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for having me back again. It's always a wonderful opportunity to be here. So I'm going to try to share the screen in a few minutes with folks, but for now, I don't have slides, so I'm going to just do some recapping first. I've got just a couple of things I want to share with you as we talk through. So for folks online, I'll try to sort of keep you as engaged on that as possible. I know, we had a couple of conversations here in the spring about the Nigerian elections. So I gather, many of you have been following events fairly closely. So but I did want to start with just a bit of a recap of a couple of the sort of main points at the time, and then build on that to say sort of what's been happening since that time over the eight months or so since the election period has passed. And I think that the main point, that we talked about last time, and I think many others have made this as well, and certainly my impression of a lot of the leading Nigerian sort of civil society groups that are working on elections talk about the impact of technology on these elections. The key sort of BVAS system, which is the bimodal voter accreditation system, which is nothing more than an iPad or a tablet that has been loaded with the proper software and stuff. But every polling unit in Nigeria had one of these that also had the fingerprint recognition technology on it. And the Electoral Commission, INEC, had been through a vast accreditation exercise where everyone got their card with the biometric data, or was supposed to. We'll talk about that in a second. And then was going to, on the election day itself, promise to have a photograph of the final results uploaded to a website at INEC called IREV, where it was promising that voters could double check to see if what was actually uploaded was what they experienced on the ground. And what was so interesting in many ways about this was that the Parliament, the National Assembly, had changed the law to say that in a dispute, the electronic data or the photograph of this was the deciding factor. So that it was meant to build up credibility in the election, and it did, and this is sort of the first main point, is that this raised expectations tremendously across the country that this was going to be a much better election. And I think in part with this expectation, it helped to fuel a third party movement led by at least in Nigerian context, upstart politician, Peter Obi from the Southeast, who really galvanized a tremendous movement on the ground, a popular movement that had really strong youth dimensions to it, had broader populist appeal, and really sort of energized this election in ways that we haven't seen for a while. As I'll say in a minute, there was certainly an ethnic dimension to this as well. This was the Southeast, which is dominated by the Igbo ethnicity. It was arguably, in terms of the Nigerian ethnic rotation principle that has built up over the years, it was the Southeast's turn for the presidency, and neither of the two big parties nominated somebody from that region. So there was also a sort of a fiery ethnic dimension to it that was revving people up. And I think a third piece of this is that we saw in this election, in ways that we haven't seen in the past, a tremendous social media dimension to this election, which meant that the diaspora was engaged in a way that was far more forceful than I think we've seen in past elections as well. So as I mentioned, the law said that in disputes, the official results would be the ones that were these photograph results. However, what the law also said, though, was that the victors would be announced based upon the collated results, which went through the old hand collation system up the chain, which went from polling unit to ward level to local government level to state level to federal level. And in past elections, you wouldn't be surprised, we've seen those numbers tend to change as they move through the night at each level of collation. So consequently, the way the electoral law had set this up was that not only did it raise these expectations of a better election, but the impacts of these technological changes would not be felt until months later in the election tribunal process, which the law said had 180 days for the tribunals to sift through this stuff, and then another 60 days for the Supreme Court. And so we still do not have a resolution of the court battles. We just a couple of weeks ago had the tribunal affirm that Bola Tinubu, the APC candidate and current sitting president, was the victor. Now it goes to the Supreme Court, and we have another 60 days, and we probably won't hear from the Supreme Court until probably early November at this point. So we're looking at months and months later, which means that essentially the courts, which have had real independence problems over the years, certainly the tribunals. The Supreme Court, I would argue, does show signs of independence, but is now facing the prospect of having to unseat a sitting president who has all the levers of power in his hands, and Bola Tinubu is not known to be a forgiving politician. So, this is a tremendous uphill battle for a court process to go through. In essence, it means that the losers are on the defensive. Losers, quote, quote, meaning, those who are declared the losers, are on the defensive, and the courts are faced with having to go to cross swords with the most powerful politicians in the nation. I'm throwing the governors into this mix as well. A couple of other things from sort of before the election, just to sort of set the scene here. The Carter Center did an assessment in December before the elections, and to sum it up, they said that although they were optimistic about the electronic process, they said that INEC did not properly stress test the BVAS and the IREV. IREV is the website system before the election. And sort of ominously, and we can now say sort of prophetically, the Carter Center warned of a website failure on election day, which is exactly what happened. INEC also, Carter Center in December was complaining that INEC was not sufficiently transparent about its inner workings with the BVAS process or with the website. And it also was not particularly transparent on how the contractor was chosen for the technology itself. An Indian contractor was chosen. How that one was chosen was not an open process. So there were a lot of question marks about the system from the outset. In addition, with these new voter cards, with all the biometric data, something like 10 million voter cards went uncollected. And during the process of the weeks and months that Nigerians were to pick up those cards, ask any Nigerian you know, and they themselves or friends that they know were not able to pick up those cards. And we had seen in past elections that the political parties would scoop up as many of these cards as possible and have their followers show up on election day and use them to get falsely accredited and to vote on behalf of their parties. Even though the accreditation system is supposed to prevent that from happening, and I'll argue in a second that in many ways it largely did. But if the INEC staff on the ground still want to let people vote, there are loopholes for them to do so. And that is a weak link in the chain, is that that's a tremendous amount of pressure on the local INEC staff, who again this time were Youth Corps members. So these are recent college graduates. These are young people, very patriotic. They were out all night. Often, many of them had not eaten through a long, stressful day, and they did a tremendous job. But also, putting them in the firing line against the political muscle of the local political establishment is a difficult thing to expect. So these 10 million voter cards, uncollected, are another sort of big question mark. And then lastly, in terms of sort of the run-up of sort of big factors we had talked about, was that the Buhari administration chose a month before national elections to switch its currency and to declare that all of the Naira notes in circulation, and this is still an economy that is heavily dependent upon cash, were no longer good, and that they had to be traded in within a short period of time for new Naira notes, which, lo and behold, were hardly available until several days before the election. And lo and behold, we were getting reports left and right that it were political party leaders that had first access to these Naira notes. So the central bank had touted this as an anti-corruption effort, was that, these parties won't have access to as much cash, so they're not going to be able to do as much vote buying. But actually it backfired in the sense that nobody had any cash except the political parties, who therefore were able to pay a premium for voters' votes, and were able to do so in a context where people were literally hungry. All around the country, observers were talking about voters coming up to them and talking about how they had not eaten for several days. So this being sort of the context in terms of the vote buying clout of the parties sort of increasing dramatically. And I want to come back to the importance of vote buying in the end. So sort of keep that in mind as we move. I want to go in a little bit. I've talked, and others have talked in the past about what was the polling data predicting at that point? Because as usual, I think although there are all sorts of problems, I'm going to show you some numbers in a second from Next Year, which I think did a pretty good job at trying to do some opinion polling just prior to the election. And I want to show you how those numbers stack up to the actual numbers, and see if that can give us just a little bit of a crystal ball into trying to figure out sort of what was happening on that day. So what you'll see, and this is still a bit of a sloppy draft of trying to get these numbers together. So let me sort of, the colors are my effort to try to make this easy for you. The middle strip there is what the Next Year numbers were predicting would be, who they predicted would be the victor in each state, and the percentage of that victory is in sort of the next line. And then the actual winners are on the right-hand column with the actual percentages by which they won. I kept it on the right. I kept it green where the prediction turned out more or less correct. Well, turned out correct in terms of the prediction, predicted it. And then you'll see the numbers on the right. I've turned the numbers red where the actual numbers were more than 10% different than the predicted numbers. So we can just get a sense of sort of what we're seeing. But before we get into the numbers, I want to take you down, for folks here in the room, go all the way down to the bottom there, which is page 2, where I just sort of collated, what the numbers came out to. And the opinion polls, and not just the next year poll, many of the other polls that were happening out there at the time were predicting a fairly solid Peter Obi victory at that point. And you can see here at the bottom, Obi by 38%, Atiku 27%, Tinubu at 23%. So this was still a fairly, it was a close race, but Obi had a fairly significant lead in the polling data. But the one sort of statistic I want to show to you that I think about this polling data, and again, I think we can talk about sort of the strengths and weaknesses of polling data in Nigeria, but I think one thing that we were seeing all across is this number right here about the 25% figure, is that the Nigerian Constitution says to win in the first round, you need to get 2/3 of the, you have to get 25% in 2/3 of the states. And here you can see that no one was getting that 2/3 number. So under the 25% rule. So we see that Peter Obi and interestingly, Abubakar Atiku were both had the 25% in 22 states. So they were close, but they did not make it. And that Tinubu was only showing 25% in about 18 states at that point in time. So, regardless of sort of, the correctness of the outcome, what was fairly clear was that we were looking at a runoff back in February, is that this was a fairly close election. And this is incredibly important because the other thing is, if you look at sort of what the actual numbers were and what the projected numbers were, no matter how you look at it, if the opposition had come together, this would have been an opposition victory. Now you have to assume, like, if Obi had, if it was only Obi, then maybe some of the Atiku voters would have gone for Tinubu, or if it was only Atiku, maybe some of the Obi voters would have gone for Tinubu. But largely, this was a highly anti-APC election, and voters really frustrated with the status quo. So this was an election for the opposition to lose. And I think Obi and Atiku, although neither of them said this, may have been gambling on a second run, a runoff, and this may have been a disincentive for them to come together before the election. Though there are other disincentives as well, and I want to talk about the opposition disunity is another sort of important macro point I would like to make today, is that the unity of the opposition, I think, is a key question about where Nigeria is going to go from here. So what did happen on election day? About a quarter of the BVAS machines failed on that day, but the failure was most particularly not of the accreditation itself. What we saw mostly on the ground as observers was that the accreditation itself worked great. There were all kinds of little problems here and there, but largely the technology worked in terms of accrediting people. We did not see a lot of signs of sort of blatant breaking of the system in the urban areas. Now, that's a big important caveat, because many of us were not allowed, because of security concerns, to go into the rural areas. And where all the skullduggery in the past typically happens, and where we were hearing reports of it as well this time around, was in the rural areas. So at least in the urban areas, we saw a pretty good process. But this 25% failure was the failure of the uploading of the data to the website. So within hours on election day, as the Carter Center predicted, the website, fairly well went down. and there was no data being reported. And so within hours, opposition folks were beginning to declare to cry foul and to say that something was going on. Somebody was cooking the numbers. Even someone who should know, President Olusegun Obasanjo, also fretted that the numbers were being cooked within INEC as this was happening. Let me just sort of review really quickly these numbers that I put up here. And I don't want to go into great details, but let me just show you a couple of trends that I noticed and see sort of if this tells us a little bit about what happened and gives us some thoughts about sort of where to go from here. What's interesting, it's not surprising, of course, that in the Southeast, in his home area, Peter Obi did almost exactly as the polling numbers predicted. Some of those numbers are actually are identical, interestingly enough. The big outlier is in Enugu, is that he did about 8 points better than the polling data was suggesting. And 96 to 97 percentile, getting that much vote in general is kind of a red flag around the world. As we know, but nonetheless, I mean, he was polling at 97% in Anambra, for instance, which is where he's from. So interestingly enough, he did just as predicted in the Southeast. And then also in the Northwest, we see pretty much things turned out fairly well as predicted. The numbers were saying this was going to be a pretty competitive race in the Northwest. And it was going to be sort of around the, mixed around the map. And the only sort of flip we see is the PDP took Kaduna by surprise. That's about 12 points over what PDP was predicted to get in Kaduna. And then the PDP did worse in Sokoto than the numbers had been predicting. But, that's not too far off compared to the other 4 zones. And it's in the other 4 zones where we see sort of all the question marks happening. So in the South-South, for instance, we see that Peter Obi was predicted to do very well across the Niger Delta. And we see that the PDP flipped Akwa Ibom and Bayelsa State by fairly commanding numbers. They upped it anywhere, by 23% in Bayelsa. I think we're looking at what is that 16% in Akwa Ibom. And then we see LP's numbers, Obi's numbers in Edo State are chopped down significantly. And then the APC flips Rivers State by a significant margin. You see APC does almost 40 percentage points better than they were polling in Rivers State. But Rivers State was clearly where observers were seeing things were sort of obviously problematic. And so that's, and Rivers State has a tradition for being, wildly problematic in previous elections. So we see the PDP and the APC sort of taking away LP votes in the South-South. In the Southwest, which is where Tinubu is coming from, here's where we see Tinubu really gaining a lot of traction. And you see almost, at least, 4 out of 6 of these numbers are in the red, where, APC does 25 to 30% better than it was polling and taking 3 LP states. Plus in Ondo, where it was predicted to win, it went, but in a fairly close margin, it takes 20% more than it was polling. So we see a massive bump in the Southwest for Tinubu. And then let me jump down to the North Central, where we also see sort of big numbers for Tinubu. APC picks up 2 PDP states and 1 LP state, outperforming its polling by 23% and 30% in Niger State and Kaduna, and more than 10% in Benue and Kwara. So in those 2 zones, a big APC pickup. I just want to, quickly note in the Northeast, which is Atiku's home zone, we see the PDP picking up 3 states from the APC by fairly large numbers there. So what this suggests to me as a starting place, of course, is this is where the traditional party ground game wins out. Is that LP, the young party, the upstart party, without the national infrastructure that the APC and the PDP have, sees itself vulnerable outside of its home base in the Southeast tremendously. And the APC and the PDP are able to pick up a tremendous amount of votes in those areas where it's vulnerable. And I think this is where the vote buying comes in, is what we did see on the ground and what we heard from a lot of voters, and particularly as the more rural we got, and I was in Akwa Ibom, the more that we saw when we were told by voters that the people in line had been paid by the political parties. And I usually folks will not tell you that, of course. And they say certain funny things that, after having done this many times, you kind of know that you're getting the party line. But every now and then you will get somebody in line who will say, oh yeah, the political party, we meet over there, and, thinking that they're doing the dutiful thing by telling the truth. But it is fairly clear that vote buying was a significant piece in shifting this. The big question for everyone is how much was shifted at INEC? How much were the numbers tinkered with in the electronic system? And certainly within hours after the election, we saw a tremendous amount of speculation on social media. And this is where that sort of social media dimension about this election comes in, which is very different, is the diaspora played a massive role in this. Is that if you look at the internet traffic, and I have a colleague at UMass that has run the numbers on this, over the days of the election and thereafter, the massive amount of sort of Nigeria-related traffic is based in the eastern coast of the United States and Europe. Is that the diaspora weighs in really heavily during this period and cries foul almost immediately, and says, this has been rigged, and of course there's a cornucopia of theories and various bits of evidence out there that the diaspora is spinning around and around and around, so that within days we see a massive sense of dashed expectations, and a sense that that this election has been rigged. CDD, one of the leading democracy groups in Nigeria, came up with the number of about vote buying at about 11%, of the polling units. I think the actual numbers are probably much higher than that. We did see situations of numbers being switched in a few states where, LP got 100,000 and PDP got 50,000, and they just switched the numbers as it went up the chain. But I think this vote buying is the larger accounting. And I go back to these sort of situations here, is that it really looks like, if you compare to the polling data, that it looks like the ground game was the significant factor. And certainly in Akwa Ibom, where I was, the PDP was flexing its muscles and bringing out the party faithful, providing funding for them. But also, there were a lot of folks that were true believers in the PDP and had been supporters of the PDP for a long time, particularly older voters. And this is another interesting dimension here, is the younger voters going for Obi, the older voters going for the establishment in the APC or the PDP, depending upon where we see, which is important. But consequently, we see this massive cynicism bust out there, even though INEC did eventually put about 94% of the photos are uploaded in about 2 weeks. So the data is still there. I have been sort of banging my head trying to see if there's anybody out there, including the political parties, that is collating this data. There are 170-something thousand polling units in Nigeria. So if 94% of them are up there, let's assume there are examples of bad data. So some INEC staff forgot to switch the camera around, so you see a photo of their face on the website. But so let's assume 90% of that data is correct. What does it say? I'm hoping maybe somebody online has had better success than I have. I have not found anybody, including civil society groups, that has actually taken the time to try to add this up. And I have not heard if the political parties have added it up and have put it up there. My guess is that nobody is collating this data. And that begs the question of why, the political parties who have the most to gain from doing this, why are they not doing this? I've been talking to folks in the OB camp, and immediately after the elections, I was saying, okay, what's your public strategy? Are you going to take this to the streets? Are you going to sort of collate the data and tell the world, look, we won, based on that? And people inside the OB camp were sort of wringing their hands saying, the lawyers have taken over. We've been locked out. So people in the media section, other parts of that, the politicals were saying, that's not the strategy we're being told to go for. So, and it looks like the PDP did the same thing, as both Atiku and Obi seem to have preferred to go the legal route. There have been demonstrations on the ground, but this has not at all been like the Occupy Nigeria protests, or the NSARS protests. Nothing to that scale, nothing to that level. Why? Instead, particularly Atiku has been pushing on a strategy of trying to disqualify, to get Tinubu disqualified by showing that he did not actually get his degree from Chicago State University in the States. And so his legal battle seems to be hinging on this technicality. And they're going for technicalities. Why is this? I'm arguing, and I know I've sort of gone on a bit long. Let me just sort of bring out a few sort of key themes here that I'm suggesting. Is why has there not been a sort of a massive street protest? Why are the civil society groups not sort of in the forefront of trying to sort of fight this in terms of the merits of the case? And I think first and foremost is there's little confidence in the courts. Is that we've seen all across the past that typically when the courts throw out elections, it's usually on some sort of technicality, that the merits of the case itself, in terms of the amount of rigging, the amount of vote buying, et cetera, have not been argued. And the Supreme Court in the past has also, when it's quibbled over something, particularly in the gubernatorial elections, has often gone to a technicality in this regard. So I think that this is a first issue, and I think that this is an important piece for reform going forward in terms of this incredibly long time for election petitions has to be dealt with. That would involve a constitutional amendment. This is something where I think the opposition can, through the legislature, try to push this, is that petitions need to be dealt with before people are sworn into office. Going back to where I started in terms of saying it's extremely hard to unseat a sitting president, and pretty dangerous if you think about it. The deep cynicism after the failure of the electronics, the anger has been primarily focused at INEC. Civil society and a lot of the sort of social media argument has been blistering in its criticism of INEC in the collapse of these technological concerns, and saying that INEC has either botched it or has fixed it, depending on who you see. And I think this has resulted in a lot of cynicism, particularly at the youth level. And I worry in terms of a future impact, the 20 to 30 somethings. Do we have another lost generation here in terms of another generation that's going to disengage from politics? And I'm going to finish on a point saying that, disengagement is absolutely the worst case scenario here. Is what is needed now is engagement. Third is the economic crisis. President Tinubu, the very first thing he did was to remove the fuel pump subsidy, which makes good economic sense in the long run, but has led to a massive spike in inflation, which then in turn has led to the naira to collapse. I think it's in the 900 range at this point. Yeah, going on 1,000 almost, right? We're quickly heading in that direction. So I think that, you know, average Nigerians are still suffering. A massive union strike about this was probably just averted yesterday. They were supposed to go on strike tomorrow. I think that's been called off because the government has suspended a tax and has agreed to raise wages, which, as we know, will have inflationary impacts over the longer term. Unemployment is still about 41%, according to KPMG this year. So the economic picture is bleak. I think the Supreme Court is highly unlikely to overturn this case. Everyone says so. I would agree as well. I don't think the chance is zero, but I think, you know, if I had to put a betting number on it, I would say a less than 10% chance that the Supreme Court is going to overturn this, and certainly the body language that they've been showing suggests that they won't. But what does this mean in terms of moving forward? And I feel that this is where we come back to the opposition. Is what is the opposition going to do with its gains as far as it had? And even though, you know, they're looking like they're going to lose this court case, let me just round up by showing you this. I know I've been saying I'm rounding up for a few minutes, but I am going to round up. I want to share just one more screenshot with you here. This is just from the internet, which shows the sort of the House of Reps results. And if you add up the dots, the APC here in the blue is 5 seats short of a majority in the House. And there was a tantalizing moment back in April when the opposition parties had announced the formation of a grand coalition in the House to try to control it. This failed. The APC, you know, was able to sort of buy off, influence, intimidate more than 5 members of the sort of the small parties over here, plus, you know, the NNPP, former Governor Kwankwaso of Kano's party, to have a comfortable enough majority in the House. But this is still together, the PDP and the APC together, if they can work with the NNPP, have pretty close to a good shot, and particularly if they can get a few defectors from the APC, at maybe moving some interesting legislation through the House. I would note that in the Senate as well, just recently after President Tinubu announced that Nigeria was going to take military action in Niger after the coup within 7 days, the Senate said no. Very much, we're not going to support that, based upon support from northern senators. Suzanne, do you have a quick? Are you able to hear me?
Oh, no, I was just putting it in advance for when you finish.
Okay, great. I'll get right back to you. I'll just wrap up here to say that the opposition has a number of interesting levers available to it, and first and foremost is the National Assembly. Second is that we focus on the presidential election, but as Nigerian observers point out, 6 governors lost in this election. The technology did work somewhat. This is a much better election than we've seen in the past. I know the Obi supporters are understandably and rightfully so deeply disappointed at the way this turned out. But in terms of the politics on the ground, the Nigerian voter matters much, much more than she or he has ever mattered in the past. And this comes back to the vote buying, is that vote buying, in my opinion, is a step forward in democratic development, in the sense that it is a step toward public policy. One way to think about public policy is it's nothing more than transparent vote buying. It's the politicians giving us what we want. That's what they're supposed to do. and vote buying, which, I got my relief check during COVID as well from the American government. Direct money transfers is something, we're talking about in a lot of different democracies. And the deal that Tinubu just brokered with the trade unions is that Nigerians are all going to get a direct shot of cash transfer as well to try to deal with the impact of the rising crisis. So it's, of course, vote buying is not something we want to condone, but rather to say that at least it means that the parties are now fighting over control of the voter. And the price of voters is going to go up over time. And I think that, as that gets harder and harder to sustain that amount, they're going to have to try to actually give good policy to deal with this. I think a lot of this, to end, deals with the Obi movement and Peter Obi and Abubakar Atiku themselves. Will they try to build a viable opposition with 4 years from now in mind? Are they going to turn into the important check and balance that Nigeria needs and actually try to push the APC government hard on its policies? And will Atiku or Obi get out of the way of the other for 4 years from now? They neither of them have shown any sort of inclination in their character to do such a thing. Although Obi was Atiku's vice presidential candidate in the past, but Obi has the Obi movement. Can they come together? So I'd be very happy to talk a lot more about these sorts of things going forward. So I've raised a number of sort of questions and sort of issues moving forward. I've got a few other points I might bring out in our conversation, but I've gone on long here. So let me stop there and thank you for your patience in listening. Thank you.
Well, Darren, thank you for that fascinating analysis of this election, which The Economist said was going to be the most important election anywhere in the world in this year. And I'm going to take the opportunity to just start and ask you, how do we assess that now? Was this actually an important election, given that it seems to have been status quo anti-election or status quo kind of election? And a big part of this was the feeling that there was going to be the opportunity for change in large measure because of a change in the electorate, the youth vote making a big difference. And I think that the overall participation was as low as 26% of expected registered voters.
Yeah.
So was this an important election, and why was there no change vote?
Yeah, I thank you for that. I do think there was a change vote in this, and again, I mean, if you add together all the opposition parties, it's an overwhelming voice for change. And for everyone, I would flag Yaga Africa in Abuja's work. They focus particularly on trying to mobilize the youth vote. And they have some really, really important sort of data and reports that they put out there that argues essentially that the youth vote was pivotal, particularly in these gubernatorial races where those 6 governors and others were sort of pushed out of power. In the National Assembly, the voice of the youth vote, the Labour Party saw its numbers go from, I think it went from 5 or 7 seats up to about 35 seats in the House. That's a massive increase in their numbers. That's a solid youth vote that was there. Also, the youth vote gave Peter Obi Lagos, which is where Tinubu is from. So I do think that there was a really interesting new number of folks. My good friend, Dr. Adekeya Adebajo in South Africa, had a really important op-ed that said, this is status quo. This election's no better, no worse than 2019 or 2015. But I actually think that that this is one of the most important elections, certainly on the continent and in the world, because of this tantalizing chance that the opposition has. I think if the opposition leaders are able to come together into some kind of a broader coalition that really tries to tell Nigerians, all right, we were locked out this time, let them make the corruption argument and say, put us back. We've got by-elections coming in 3 gubernatorial elections in November. We've got other sort of off-term elections in the years to come after that. And then in 4 years, we got another big election. Peter Obi is the youth candidate. He's only in his early 60s, you know. So, you know, he's a spring chicken. He's doing good. And he, you know, he's got time. And he could be, you know, far more of a unifying factor depending upon how he plays his cards. And this is the thing that worries me, is that the more that his supporters try to turn this into sort of the Igbo were robbed election, which is a very viable interpretation of this, and the more that his opponents try to turn this into an Igbo issue, it's a loser for him. And I think Obi was very good in the campaign at trying to say, look, I am not the Igbo candidate. I am a national candidate. I'm the reform candidate. He's got to keep that going. If the opposition can, around him, develop a movement, use the House, and engage a demoralized civil society in public, I think, you know, this is the start of something, you know, tremendous. But again, you know, there's still some cards to be played.
Amazing answer. Not exactly what I would have expected either, but should we start in the room and see if anyone in the room would like to ask? I know we have some hands raised in Zoom land.
Question. So a lot, you know, this whole sheet you hand out, which is really useful and sort of as a point of comparison. How accurate is polling in Nigeria? I'm just curious, like, how are these polls done? I mean, you know, we have a lot of these debates in the U.S. about the accuracy of polling, and I am not sure how, you know, polling methodologies might be similar or different in Nigeria.
Yeah, and as a disclaimer to start, so the question is about the accuracy of polls in Nigeria, and I'm not a poll master in this regard, but my understanding is that certainly, you know, there are a wide range of this, and which is why I used, for my sort of red numbers on the list, why I used 10 percentage points for a margin of error, which is very wide. You know, but just to show that, you know, where the egregiously different numbers were. But I like the next year polling in particular because they were very conscious of the fact that Obi was a heavily youth-oriented movement and a heavily urban movement. So they very consciously tried to, they had sample sizes of anywhere between 60 and 200 in each state, in all 36 states. And they very consciously tried to get out of urban areas and to get out of anywhere where there were universities or strong youth areas to try to.
Did you say sample size of 60 to 200
per state?
Per 60 to 200 people?
No, yes,
that's pretty low.
That's almost nothing.
It's very low. Yeah, it's very low. So altogether, as a national sampling, you know, they were making a national. So it is low, but it was one of the highest ones that I saw in terms of, at least on the Nigerian side. I have not seen the Afrobarometer numbers, and I don't know if they did a state-by-state opinion polling. Yeah, so they are lower numbers, but it's the best that I came. So this is why these are, you know, thumbnails, you know, or sort of, you know, broad contours.
Question from Suzanne.
Okay.
Suzanne, do you want to?
Yeah.
Ask your question.
Yes. Okay. Darren, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk, which was full of facts, full of data, and some interesting observations. So I appreciated all of that. I'm not a Nigeria specialist, but I followed it pretty closely. And so I wanted to pose a more generic question, is that not just in Africa, but elsewhere, including here, we often see opposition parties crying foul, even when the election was perfect, or let's say not perfect, but credible. So to be honest, I never thought, I mean, although I think the Lagos phenomenon of Obi winning in Lagos, I mean, is it explicable because urban areas are less ethnically, or more multi-ethnic, let's say, than rural areas. So to me, I didn't see how he could have won. Admittedly, he had the youth vote, but he also had ethnicity going against him, regardless of what people say. And classically, I'm sure there was some vote buying, but I thought your point about the fact that nobody's actually done the numbers on this stuff. And I mean, for instance, in Kenya, which is my specialty, there were all sorts of groups, including the BBC, doing fact checking. So, I mean, a classic for anyone who doesn't want to accept loss, which is what I'm talking about, the generic question, is this an election about a refusal, notwithstanding the rigging, the distrust in institutions, the INEC, the internet going down, because we've heard this before in other places, I mean, Tinubu had a machine, which Obi did not have. And I think that cannot be discounted. I'm sure he had lots of people who, forgiven past provisions, would be interested in him continuing. So my question is, maybe you could try and put this in sort of a more comparative, not that I mean, with using your stuff from Nigeria perspective, is this just another example of the opposition crying foul when in fact they lost? Do you, I mean, and I don't know how you can even answer this, because if there are no counter checks, I mean, of course there could be rigging, but was there enough rigging to change the outcome of the election? Maybe people couldn't vote, they couldn't get their cards, they couldn't do a whole pile of things, but was there enough so that the election would have been different? And do we have any? So that's my question, because the story you're telling, while extremely interesting, and also I didn't think Obi, having the youth vote, youth is always more, will vote for change and populist parties, but the whole country is not youth. So my question is this just part of what we're seeing worldwide, and the fact that the diaspora weighed in, well, that's not surprising either. And the internet was highly in favor of Obi. I mean, all through it, I was really surprised that people thought he could win, to be honest. So my question is this just another example of crying foul when the election actually might have been credible? Or even if parts of it weren't credible, what's your take on that? Putting it more in comparative perspective and what we know about elections in the world and in Africa. So thank you very much again for a great talk.
No, thank you for that. And I think you've summed up well, I think, the direction I was going with this as well. Is I think the first, the sort of the evidential answer is that we don't know, for sure, is that because nobody, I was hoping somebody here or online was going to say, oh, somebody has collated this stuff and I just hadn't found it. But I've been checking in with friends, civil society folks, and there was one website that started to collate some of it on election day that I found, and then they stopped and went off the air. So I don't know what happened to it, but assuming that, that somebody hasn't been doing it, it means that we don't know for certain.
But except, let me just intervene quickly. Elsewhere, people do analyses of past elections in the country, and they know how people have voted, so one doesn't. I mean, we have people interrogating the official data, not necessarily because they have parallel data, but they have parallel evidence from previous elections. So I'm just, I don't think you can necessarily expect somebody to come up Deus Ex Machina with a parallel thing. I was just mentioning the BBC because they did, but they were all interrogating the official data based on what we know about voting patterns. So I'm just, I'm very surprised that nobody was doing that in Nigeria. It's sort of incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, we do have good evidence of clear shifting of the of sort of straight out rigging in parts of Lagos and in River State, and there's a lot of good sort of social media video footage and that sort of stuff of a lot of that happening on the ground, but I'm more inclined, and I think that's sort of where I was going with my Excel sheet, saying that I I really feel like it was the APC and the PDP ground game, that the fact that they have, a strong infrastructure, party infrastructure on the ground, they have deep pockets, and they have tremendous experience, in terms of the management of elections and the way the game is played in Nigeria. But also, too, is that, with this vote buying is that, they have a party faithful, in the rural areas, in the urban areas that they can mobilize. And so, which lends strength to the notion that, and where I sort of began with this is I feel like this was going to be a runoff, is I think that these three candidates were actually really close. And so the big question would have been in the runoff, where would, the sort of the third and fourth party supporters go? The Kano supporters from the NNPP and others. And I think in that vote, I think Tinubu was going to be a strong contender, but had the opposition come together, I think, certainly if the PDP machine had gotten together with the LP machine, and definitely if Kwankwaso and Kano had been brought on board and been able to deliver Kano, then I do think the opposition could have won this. But as it played out, it's not unthinkable that Tinubu actually did get the most votes on the ground. And for the reasons you mentioned, that Obi's reach may not have been as far as it was, but however, sort of, we can trust the polling data. My sense is, and I saw other polls again going in that direction, that Obi was doing quite a bit better outside of his own sort of ethnic zone and in the Niger Delta than we expected. So I'm pretty comfortable with thinking that he was the front runner of the three. But as you said, we just don't know until we get those numbers collated.
And how do you feel this feeds into a comparative perspective of opposition's always crying foul? And even what you were saying, a divided opposition, that's always been the death knell for the opposition in general.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with you that there's a continental pattern, which is becoming a global pattern, as we know here in the U.S. Of a reflexive rejection by opposition of any polling outcome, and I think, which is all the more reason, at least in Nigeria's case, why these election disputes have to be dealt with more speedily, because it's become the norm as part of the election process. So the system needs to account for it. Yeah.
Thank you, Darren. We have a question from Moses. Moses, do you want to?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, you can hear me. Thank you very much, Darren Q, for your analysis. I think I enjoyed your analysis. But I'm from Nigeria. Even in Nigeria, I have some issue with. For instance, you have concluded that this election was better than other elections in Nigeria. I will call public dispensation. Elections has been conducted in Nigeria, but if you have been observing election, like you said, you will discover that most of the elections results that are posted do not actually reflect the vote. So when the Electoral Act was reformed prior to this 2023 election, there was a lot of enthusiasm among Nigerians, given the fact that beavers, which you mentioned, that they are going to use to authenticate, as well as electronic transmission of results, were put in the Electoral Act. Remember, this introduction of technology started in 2015, but the Nigerian Supreme Court said that will not be used. The smart reader was not in the most elections that were overturned by the lower court, was already overturned by the Supreme Court. And so there was that pressure on the art.
I'm really
so
sorry.
that electronic or technology, the use of technology would be, captured in the Electoral Act.
Moses, can you
hear me?
Yeah, can you hear us,
Oh my
Moses?
God.
Moses, can you
Hello?
hear us?
Let's
Moses?
ask him to type his question.
Yes, I can hear you, but can you hear me?
Having a hard time hearing you. So could you type your question?
Can you hear me, please?
Not well. So could you please type your question as a chat?
Oh, I think he cut
Yeah,
out.
I think it was not
reconnect.
a good connection.
So we have a question from Tim Weiskell in the chat box. First, the sharing of an article from Deutsche Welle News called "How Credible Are Nigeria's Election Results?" Thanks, Tim. And I'll read your question out loud. Do the electoral processes and procedures have any real hope of keeping pace with the underlying rate of change in places like the eastern Nigeria and Lagos, which are going to be in a more or less perpetual state of crisis with sea level rise? So far, the response to unrest among populations in the east has been to bomb them. Nigerian Air Force bomb suspected, and thank you for linking that article. So do you want to take that question, Darren?
Okay, thanks, Elsa. Okay, thank you for that question as well, Tim. I think that the security picture is the big issue, and what was so fascinating about the election period and so telling was how the security picture improved when the political parties wanted things secure so they could campaign. So in the sort of the exact election period, there was actually, it was a fairly quiet area. There was, one of the Boko Haram factions did go on the offensive locally at one point, but even that was not, particularly of the scale as we've seen it's capable of. And so I think it shows the strong connection between the political class and the sort of levels of violence in the country. And that violence has only continued since the election, period ended. So, the ability of the Tinubu government and the governors themselves at different levels to actually try to deal with the security crisis is going to be a pivotal, I think, metric whereby Nigerians are going to judge, each of these, at the federal and state level administrations. I fear as the economic crisis is only getting worse, the security picture is only going to get worse as incentives for kidnapping and these other sort of gang activities are only going to be increased in this. So, in terms of the environmental picture, I'm not seeing any sort of significant sort of national initiative or state level initiative to deal with that problem comprehensively as of yet. I think the security picture has to be dealt with as soon as possible. Bola Tinubu does have a strong track record in terms of engaging these kinds of actors in Lagos and bringing them into, to some extent, sort of a governing fold. It'll be interesting to see whether he is capable of doing that, at the national level. But I would definitely agree that the worsening security picture makes it far, far more difficult for sort of the opposition, civil society, reformist coalitions that I'm saying have an opportunity to work here. Do you want to read, Moses, or?
Sure. And then there's a question for Tim from Tim Longman as well. So you'll be next, Tim. So the question, thank you, Moses, for reiterating your question. My contribution is that the 2023 general election was the worst because INEC abandoned the rules of the elections in the middle of the election. For instance, BVAS and electronic submission of result was not done in the presidential election. So it's a commentary. Did you have a question you wanted to add that, Moses?
Why don't we go to Tim Longman right now?
Okay. Sounds good.
Tim,
why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Sorry, I couldn't come today. I have a sick kid at home, so I'm there in person. I'm curious about the comparison of the different levels of the election. So in Uganda, Museveni really focused on stealing the election for presidency, but didn't really care much about parliament. And so the parliamentary results seem to be pretty on target. The presidential vote was skewed in his favor. In Congo, in contrast, they when Kabila put Tshisekedi in power, they skewed the presidential vote some, but the parliamentary votes they just made up. I mean, they just bear no relationship whatsoever to the actual votes cast. And so I'm curious whether you know whether there seems to be more validity at different levels.
Yeah, I'm still trying to do sort of the gubernatorial and the assembly level analyses. So this is still sort of very preliminary on my part, but it certainly looks to me like we've seen a lot of credibility at the sort of gubernatorial and at the National Assembly level. At the state assemblies, I don't have a lot of optimism there yet, but I would like to dig into that. I think, because there's so many more races, it's all over the map. But at least I've seen that the quality is improving in the sense that, and this is where, using polling data like this is sort of kind of my best barometer that I've got at the moment, is that at least it seems like predictions beforehand, based on sort of very, very, very small public opinion samplings, suggest that, public will is reflected in more and more of these outcomes. Whether it's exactly correct or not, I can't get into yet. The parallel vote counts, the parallel vote count for the presidential election showed some variation, but they didn't have it at sort of the other levels. So we don't have sort of good parallel counts to my knowledge at these. But at least from sort of the civil society side, an argument that many of the states saw sort of better gubernatorial race outcomes, and sort of better legislative outcomes, particularly because the Senate and the House of Representatives were run at the same time as the presidency. You were voting for the same thing at the same time. And what was fascinating in terms of like the BVAS data, for instance, we saw where the polling unit staff were able to upload their results for the Senate and the House, but were not able to do it for the presidential, which sort of begged the question is why did it work for the other two and not for this? So, if there were efforts to try to foil the system underway, they seem to have been focused more on the presidency and only in certain parts of the federation. And I wonder whether we could say similar at the gubernatorial level and at the assembly. But my gut feeling is that we're seeing quite a few better outcomes, and just the fact that the opposition was able to take over the House, I think is an interesting sign of that, as well as the overturning of many of these governors. In the past elections, whoever the previous governor was, we saw a remarkable correlation with who the new victor would be. This time around, we've seen a number of those instances where that was not the case. So I do think we're seeing a stronger INEC than in the past, which gets to some of Moses's points. But we're not there yet. But I do think we're looking at some growing strength. Thanks. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Here?
Can I?
Yeah. Hey.
No, I'm just curious. So when you show the map about the assembly,
yeah.
So the LP has only 30 something. So thinking of the American system, and the president won't be able to govern with that kind of in the assembly. So how was balance? Does that mean like the executive is powerful and can veto over whatever the assembly thinks? So how is the situation? I don't assume it's be like United States, which has veto power. And
yeah. A question about sort of the relative power of the presidency over the National Assembly. How much sort of leverage does the National Assembly have? And if I understood correctly, you were suggesting, for instance, if for some reason Obi or Atiku were made president, they would have a very small, a much smaller sort of minority in both houses of Parliament. So what would that look like? I think that the presidency has definitely in Nigeria even more leverage over the parliament than, say, the president does here in the United States or in other presidential systems, because it controls the purse in so many ways. Even though on paper the National Assembly is supposed to control it, but in fact the presidency has messed with and withheld funds in many sort of disputes. over the years, and still has that kind of funding leverage that it uses against the National Assembly. But I believe that the National Assembly has grown in independence with every 4 years, and I feel one of the exciting things about the next 4 years is that we do have a sizable opposition that could, if it wishes, I wouldn't say check the presidency, but at least cause it some headaches that could enliven that check and balance in a way that we've only seen in fits and starts in the past. So, but still, the presidency has, I think, a lot of leverage, and Tinubu will be gunning for a second term, presumably, and so we'll take revenge on legislators that don't play ball. Yeah.
Okay, we're nearing the end of our time. If there are no more burning questions, are there any more burning questions out there? Then let me say to Darren Q, this has been a fascinating discussion. I think we all wished that somehow these elections would provide a great deal of clarity. And while the elections themselves have not, maybe you have, at least in how to analyze what actually happened in these elections. I have to say myself that at some level, from your presentation, the sense is this was not such a bad election after all, but it still presents a series of ambiguities and a result that is ambiguous and to some degree dissatisfying or unsatisfying for people who are hoping for something different, which is probably often the case. One would hope, though, that in all this, and I wonder if I could just ask one last question, Darren. Of course. From what you saw here, do we think that in Nigeria, the trend is our friend in terms of better elections?
Wow, that's a question. And it's easy for me as an outsider, sitting comfortably in Boston to say as such. But as someone who has been watching for a long time, these elections, if you go back 20 years to 1999, 2003, and certainly 2007, there's no comparison. These elections are far better, far more credible, and the Nigerian electorate was so much more engaged, even though those numbers were only 27% turnout, and the turnout has been dropping with every 4 years. I gave the reasons why on polling day itself. I think it was so much lower than we expected, but the public engagement through social media, through conversation about the elections was so intense this time around that I feel that the trend is in the right direction in terms of the possibility for a Nigerian movement or movements to try to really get this to the kind of election qualities that we see in Kenya or Ghana or other parts of the continent, which are not perfect elections either, but I think are far better than sort of the Nigeria. So I think it's on the right track. There's still plenty of time for the politicians to burn the house down.
Yes.
But they're doing their best in some ways. But I think I have a lot of faith in the energy of the Nigerian electorate and civil society, and I think they're gonna make this work. It's going to be a few more elections, I fear.
A few more elections. Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, well, good to know. So everyone, let's thank Darren Q for this terrific presentation. I also would like to thank Elsa Vihey, who has been called in to try to make the technology work. She's actually been called in many different things over the last month or two.
I thank Dr. Q for your patience with our rudimentary technology today, but we'll get better with time.
We're working on it. I'd like to say to our audience that we are now planning to have very regular Walter Rodney lectures for the rest of the semester, every single Monday this semester until November 20th, with the exception of next Monday, which is Indigenous Peoples Day. There will be on the 16th a talk by Jacobo Tehindrazana Ravello. He is a former foreign minister of Madagascar, and he will be speaking on decolonizing law in Africa, an analysis of African countries' efforts to evolve their laws away from colonial frameworks that were left there for them. Very interesting question. On the 23rd of October, Tony Yeboah will be speaking on Kumase, the capital city of trees. On the 30th, Professor Baba Jallow from Harvard will be speaking about inclusive transitional justice, specifically focusing on the situation in Gambia. Our very own David Glovsky will be here on November 6th, and will be speaking on debating the nation's state, mobility, and the questioning of national sacrifice in Guinea and Guinea-Bissau. And on the 13th of November, Mam Fatou Niang from Carnegie Mellon will be speaking on Franc-Afrique from an Afro-French perspective, and actually the demise of how do you pronounce it properly? France-Afrique, not Franc-Afrique. France-Afrique. That should be really interesting. And our last one will be on the 20th of November, when Daniel Agbiboa from Harvard will be speaking on citizen science, the human face of climate change in Africa. I would add, that's a very busy schedule. So for those of you who love things about Africa, there's even more, because on November 1st, Mohammed Mughar Sarr, the author, will be speaking with the Department of Romance, as it turns out, not romance languages, but the Department of Romance, Romance Studies. It's an amazing turn of phrase. And that should be a fascinating talk. And finally, also on October 30th, if you haven't had enough, Daniel Runde, who is an expert on American aid policy, is going to be examining that aid policy with a talk that will also include a lot of discussion about the interaction with Africa and African economies. So plenty coming up this fall. Anything that we should say in parting? Any last comments?
If you haven't done so already, sign up for our newsletter. The link is in the chat box, and you can keep abreast of all the upcoming events that we have. So looking forward to seeing you next time, and hopefully in 2 weeks for our next Walter Rodney series on October 16th.
October 16th. Okay, thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your week.